Hello and welcome to our program. My name is Mark Kligman. I am the interim director of the Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. The Nazarian Center is situated in UCLA's International Institute, and our center provides academic discourse that addresses Israel's history and culture, both past and present. We encourage you to join our mailing list and to check out our other programs. We'll provide some links in the chat box as this program continues. We have other programs coming up that we encourage you to be a part of. For example, our next program on May 13th at 12 o'clock is another Zoom session entitled The Youth, Social Media in Iran-Israel Relations, Digital Bridges and Cyber Battlegrounds with Leora Hendelman Ba'avor, who's a senior research fellow at the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and the moderator will be Steve Zipperstein. We want to thank today's co-sponsors, the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, the Department of Ethnomusicology, the Center for Near Eastern Studies, and the UCLA African Studies Center. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ilana excuse me. Dr. Ilana Webster-Kogen is an ethnomusicologist by training, specializing in music, diaspora, and ethnicity in the urban Middle East. Her work focuses on music, diaspora, and ethnicity in the urban Middle East. Her first book, Citizen Azmari, Making Ethiopian Music in Tel Aviv, which she will talk on today, was published in 2018 by Wesleyan University Press, for which she conducted fieldwork in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem among Ethiopian immigrants and newer Eritrean asylum seekers. The book won the Society for Ethnomusicology's Jewish Music Section Publication Prize in 2019, and Ilana's academic writing has appeared in the Ethnomusicology Forum, African and Black Diaspora, and the Journal of African Cultural Studies. She currently serves as the co-chair of the Society for Ethnomusicology's Jewish Music Special Interest Group. I've known Ilana for a number of years. I really admire the work and research she does, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from her. We encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ilana Webster-Kogen.
Thank you so much, Mark, and to all of our hosts. In February, I had guests for Shabbat dinner who were recent arrivals in London from Jerusalem, and as we sat down at the table, they immediately asked about this image framed on my wall. They asked what it was. I responded that it was the Kebra Nagast, the foundational epic of Ethiopian civilization. In the story, canonized in the 14th century, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, pays a visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem. The outcome of their liaison is a child called Menelik, who returns to Jerusalem when he was 18 to meet his father. And during that visit, he steals the Ark of the Covenant and takes it to Ethiopia, symbolically transferring Jerusalem's holiness to Ethiopia. I've recounted this story many times, and visitors usually wish to follow up because the story is tantalizingly familiar, but not well known outside of Ethiopia. The Kebra Nagast is much longer than the short account of the Queen of Sheba's visit in the Bible, in 1 Kings 10, 1-13. This particular visitor had a follow-up for which I have rehearsed the response for 15 years. He asked, "The Ethiopians in Israel, are they really Jewish?" When he asked me that, I felt a little bit like weeping because I realized that the only reason I hadn't been asked that particular question in several years was simply that I haven't spent very much time in Israel since the pandemic. This particular guest was educated and not politically suspect, in my opinion. He said nothing else that evening that gave me pause. But the attitude towards Ethiopian-Israelis, that they are somehow a curiosity and that their backstory remains opaque, is almost beyond belief considering how much has been written about them. And I've heard this question so many times since doing the original fieldwork for my book, Citizen Azmari, all the way back in 2008, that we have to ask why. So my first intervention today is to consider why this question persists in 2025. And I have another question too. A few years ago, a former member of my department was upset about something the department had done and accused the whole department of being Zionist. I was the only Jewish member of the department at the time. The list of accusations included admitting an Israeli PhD student into the PhD program and collaborating with an Israeli musician on an album. The department filed a complaint. Attacks against a specific Jewish member of staff do often go unchallenged, But for others to be tainted by association with the charge of Zionism is a bridge too far. And the individual was reminded of the universal conduct to apologize. The individual offered an apology and then took to social media to criticize the department for victimizing them. A number of equally disgruntled individuals then launched into a tirade about my predecessor and me for doing work about ethnic minorities in Israel when there was an occupation of the Palestinians in front of everyone's eyes. I stay off social media, so I never had to engage with this venom directly, apart from the occasional screenshot texted by a colleague. But this was also a trope that I had grown uncomfortably used to. Why did I work on this and not that? I have published articles or books about 4 different projects, and this is the only one that I was ever called to account for. And some of you here might have encountered something similar when venturing beyond Jewish studies themselves. Because I work at a university where BDS is the default position of the academy, the Senate, and individual departments, it's possible that I've grown accustomed to what some of you will have been encountering for the first time over the past year and a half. At first, I was perplexed. This is sort of 10 and 15 years ago. For some of my colleagues, my work, that you'll hear in a minute, is quite critical of what I see as structural racism in Israeli society, and certainly coming from the state. That work was still suspect because it didn't fundamentally define the state of Israel as illegitimate. Individuals in my institution who worked on the Knesset, say, or on critical histories of 1948, or who conducted ethnographies of soldiers who committed war crimes, were less suspect because the political ideology was self-evident in the framing. But Ethiopian-Israelis are too liminal. They're not recognizably Israeli enough. And in the words of one particularly unnecessary attack against me at a conference, they are too depoliticized. Esther Rada, a soul singer who has sustained a successful career over a decade, puts it very well. And we'll listen to 2 minutes of what Esther has to say.
פתאום אנחנו קבוצה אחת. האחים שלי, באמת אחים שלי, למען אחי ורעי. אנחנו ביחד בסיפור הזה. תמיד ראיתי את עצמי כאזרחית העולם. שום דבר לא מגביל אותי. אין גבולות, זה הכל פיקציה. ופתאום, אחרי 7 באוקטובר, משהו שהתחדד לי מאוד, זה שאני קודם כל יהודייה. ואין לי לאן לברוח. זה מה שאני. וזה טלטל אותי. זה משהו שהיה קל לי לזנוח, כי ישראלית זה מה שאני, נולדתי כאן, זה הדרכון שלי ישראלי, אני לא יכולה לברוח מזה. גם האתיופיות שלי, אני לא יכולה לברוח ממנה. הנשיות, האישה שאני, אני לא יכולה לברוח מזה. וביהדות יש איזושהי בחירה. אתה יכול להיות דתי, אתה יכול להיות לא דתי, אתה יכול להאמין באלוהים, אתה יכול לא להאמין באלוהים. זה משהו כזה כביכול מופשט. בחו"ל אף אחד לא ידע שאני יהודייה. לא מנחשים את זה, לא חושבים את זה, המראה שלי נורא מתעתע. כן ידעו שאני ישראלית, ועדיין היו הפגנות נגדי. היו כמה וכמה פעמים שהיו מגיעים ומנסים להחרים את המופע, אנשים שעומדים בכניסה ומחלקים ברושורים נגדי, או מגיעים עם דגלי פלסטין למופע. ואז אני עולה לבמה, והם רואים אותי, והם לא יודעים איך להתמודד. מתפוצץ להם המוח. רגע, מה אני אמור לעשות? אני גם שחורים אני אוהב, איך אני מפגין פה? וזה שימח אותי. תמיד הדבר הראשון שהייתי עולה לבמה, הייתי אומרת, אני באתי לכאן מישראל.
Esther talks about this in interview and in the interviews that she gave me for my book. And what she says, and what I really found in my research, is that as difficult as it is for an imagined Israeli mainstream to think of this group of Ethiopians as part of Klal Yisrael, It is equally different for the world to make sense of how this particular group disrupts well-rehearsed definitions of Israel, Jews, and Zionism. So my second intervention today is to respond to Esther Rada by arguing that far from making Israeli culture more relatable or palatable, Ethiopian Israelis and their music are particularly offensive to the discourses against normalization coursing through the academy, because this disruption is often unwelcome. In 2015, I published my first book, Citizen Azmari, Making Ethiopian Music in Israel. It was published with a terrific press in ethnomusicology, Wesleyan University Press's Music Culture Series, and it won a major book subvention and a small book prize. It's taken me a long time to be able to acknowledge publicly about this book what I have known from the beginning about the uncomfortable positionality of Ethiopian Israelis. So I'm going to be a bit braver than I'm used to being, and I'll disclose a few things to this group. Citizen Azmari has never been reviewed, and I have never given a single book talk for it. You can read the book yourself to decide if maybe it just doesn't deserve scholarly attention. I have definitely read worse books. It has taken a full-scale assault on the Jewish presence on university campuses for me to be able to reflect critically on, among other things, my own reticence when it came to promoting the book. So with thanks to Mark for specifically asking me to talk about the book, I'm going to introduce Ethiopian-Israeli music here with a little bit about the book and some discussion about what's happened in the world since the book came out. In the process, I will reflect on what I learned during fieldwork about what it is like to be Black in Israel and to face the world outside Israel as someone who doesn't look Israeli. Finally, I'll make a case to Israel studies scholars who are here, as I do to Jewish studies scholars every chance I get, to take music seriously as a path into the intimate spaces of those communities. After a brief overview of the book and a couple of case studies from it, I will move on to the questions that are really pertinent about the book for this group, namely, one, what is happening in Israel that this question of whether Ethiopian Israelis are Jewish still persists? How is Blackness coded in Israel? How does anti-Blackness work in practicality when Ethiopians sometimes join nationalist political parties? So how do dynamics of Blackness and anti-Blackness shape the discourses of belonging that I've been pursuing since the earliest days of my work? And second, looking at Israel from the outside, even before the war, but especially now that boycott of Israeli cultural institutions is operating in full force, how do these same dynamics of Blackness and anti-Blackness that affect Ethiopian Israelis so profoundly at home play out on the world stage? I'll make an argument that the cultural output of this particular group is singularly destabilizing, both internally and externally. Not everyone will know a lot about Ethiopian Israelis, so let's go back to the beginning. Who are Ethiopian Israelis? How did Jews get to Ethiopia? How did Ethiopians get to Israel? And what is life like there in Israel? The people I describe here as Ethiopian Israeli have been known over the past 500 years as Ehud, Falasha, Ethiopian Jews, Beta Yisrael, or for other groups of people, Falash Mora, Ethiopian, Yotzei Ethiopia, which name reveals the constantly shifting social status of the world's best known Black Jews. Each name reveals the disjuncture of being Jewish in Ethiopia or Black and Jewish. Many of the details of Ethiopian Jewish history, immigration, and life in Israel are known outside of the Ethiopian population, Ethiopian Israeli population, because of the work of ethnomusicologists and ethnographers like Stephen Kaplan, Hagar Salomon, Lisa Entebbe Yamini, and of course, Kay Kaufman-Shalomé. Scholars of Beta Yisrael studies document religious and social history, religious rites and everyday customs, personal narratives of immigration to Israel, and experience of marginality once settled in Israel. The history of Ethiopian Jewry is peppered with drama over religious authenticity and racial difference. The first references to Jews in Ethiopia mention the Ehud, a South Semitic cognate of the Hebrew word for Jew. This term gave way around the 17th century to Falasha, wanderer, which implied religious otherness since non-Christians were forbidden from owning land. In contrast, people who claim Jewish roots in Ethiopia call themselves Beta Yisrael, means Israel. Until the later 20th century, Beta Yisrael lived in villages in northern Ethiopia. And here you can see some pictures that I took in Ethiopia of rock-hewn churches that are carved into mountains, where they survived as smiths and potters and lived in extended family units. As iron workers who transformed objects through the use of fire, they were often cursed by their Christian neighbors as Buddha, or as semi-human sorcerers capable of transforming themselves into hyenas. They were non-rabbinic, meaning they followed biblical laws meticulously. The Torah, or Rit, is written in the South Semitic language of Ge'ez, and they paid special attention to matters of personal purity. And being non-rabbinic, there were some aspects of their ritual calendar that diverged from that of the dominant religion. In 1973, Beta Israel were accepted as the blessed tribe of Dan by then Sephardi Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. The proclamation entitled Beta Israel to immigrate to Israel as Jews, which they saw as a renewal of the covenant. The first major wave took place in 1984 and 1985, when Beta Israel villagers left their homes in Gondar, northwestern region of Ethiopia, and descended the Ethiopian highlands at great personal risk. It's estimated that several thousand died en route, settling temporarily over the Sudanese border in refugee camps such as Gedaref. The Israeli government airlifted 8,000 Beta Israel secretly in January 1985 in what came to be known as Operation Moses. Some of the villagers who were left behind moved to Addis Ababa to await later transport to Israel, and a second airlift called Operation Solomon brought 14,000 Beta Israel to Israel in May 1991, in the last days of an Ethiopian military dictatorship. Beta Israel were thrilled to arrive in Israel, but found it difficult to adjust to life there. They did not speak the language yet. They spoke Amharic or Tigrinya back in Ethiopia, and their skills as smiths and potters were unsuited to the Israeli economy. Their extended family networks were broken up by a housing policy that favored the nuclear family, and the uprooting of the extended family unit in Israel has wrought substantial damage on Ethiopian-Israeli family life, yielding problems of crime, domestic violence, and suicide today. And once they arrived, the rabbinate grew suspicious of Beta Israel religious legitimacy and requested symbolic conversion from many of them. Many of the key episodes in Ethiopian-Israeli life the past 30 years relate to matters concerning rabbinic acceptance or purity and hygiene. So some of them you may have read about in the news, such as the blood episode in 1996, when it was revealed that Ethiopian blood donations were discarded en masse. There were reports in 2012 about Ethiopian women who had been forcibly sterilized. And then there are happier stories about the recognition of Sigd, the main Ethiopian Jewish festival, being recognized as an Israeli national holiday in 2008. And the ordination of Kesim, those are sort of Jewish Ethiopian Beta Israel clergy in 2018, despite the fact that they had been denied ordination for a long time, and that the generally Ethiopian Jewish rituals had appeared to be giving way to more mainstream modes of national religious life. So in my fieldwork, I encountered the same sets of concepts and themes frequently. Musicians and audience members would talk to me about the way that they positioned themselves in a number of different ways. And those primarily fell into three different categories. You had, as you just heard Esther Rada saying a minute ago, that I have come to realize that Kodem Kol Ani Yehudiya, but first and foremost, I am a Jew. There is nowhere to escape to. So sometimes you will find, very often, you will find Beta Israel framing migration to Israel as a renewal of the covenant, confirmation of the covenant, generally a part of Kibbutz Galuyot, the ingathering of exiles. That's a sort of key Zionist key cornerstone of Zionism. In contrast, you will hear teenagers, and Esther Rada earlier in her career, positioning themselves as being part of sort of an Afro-diasporic network, where they connect very closely to the experience of African Americans, and where a main issue for them in their music and youth culture is police brutality. And then you'll also have, particularly among musicians, people who draw quite a lot of inspiration from Ethiopian modes of cultural production, sometimes that they would have grown up with in rural Ethiopia, and sometimes that they will have acquired through media literacy of life in Addis Ababa, which many of them have never visited. So in the book, I talk about how all of this plays out musically. So the argument hinges on developing really extensively how those three different strands play out in musical style: the Zionist mode, the Ethiopianist, and Afro-diasporic. The way that these different tropes play out, sometimes in their own ways within a musical style, and how they're sometimes creatively combined to create new modes of citizenship. I argue that music is the driving force in constructing Ethiopian-Israeli citizenship narratives. You will find very high representation of Ethiopian musicians in Israeli society, and that's across genres, in dance troupes, among rappers, soul musicians, Azmari musicians, those are Ethiopian folk musicians. You'll also find lots of fusion projects and lots of Ethiopian record shops in the big cities. And so I argue that the exaggeration or reconfiguration of the mythology, Zionist, Ethiopianist, and Afro-diasporic mythologies, refract the perspective of this particular group of marginalized citizens. So I do that through a close reading of the genres of music that I worked most closely with. So I talk about Esther Rada and the way that she creatively fuses various Afro-diasporic styles using African-American popular music of several kinds, jazz, soul, neo-soul, combining it with Ethiopian modes like Ethio jazz and also a bit of reggae. I talk about the Azmari bet. That's the institution where a traditional folk poet will hurl insults at their paying customers in Amharic, and people will dance to show their appreciation for the insults. I talk about the Idan Reichel project, a really well-known fusion, the best known of the fusion projects that really fits incredibly well into broader tropes of sort of liberal Zionism. Then we talk about eskesta dance. That's the Ethiopian national shoulder dance, where in almost any absorption center in Israel, you'll find young people getting together into a dance troupe and performing for paying and non-paying audiences as a sort of mode of reviving cultural heritage to pre-recorded music. Then I talk about rappers, one group in particular who made a big splash. But in general, I talk about the way that rappers tend to rap in Hebrew, and they establish themselves within pretty well-known Zionist tropes, while also positioning themselves aesthetically as inheritors of of Afro-diasporic musical traditions. And then finally, I talk about the encounter today of Ethiopian-Israelis with more recent arrivals from Eritrea in a wave in the early 21st century of asylum seekers from the Horn of Africa. So to jump into listening to a little bit of music, here is an example that I have always found to be especially illustrative. This is by far the most popular video that came out during my year of fieldwork in Tel Aviv. And for those of you who have never heard Ethiopian hip hop before, this will be sort of a greatest hits one. But for those of you who don't know Ethiopian hip hop, but do know, for example, the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik, you might recognize some key tropes from labor Zionism in here, creatively fused with hip hop and reggae.
אנשים שמים לי צ'קים, דפים, מסמכים מסובכים, היפי כוח, בלבול מוח, אומרים זה שוטף 90. כל הזמן מערבבים אותי בחרטות, מבין רק מזומנים, אז בוא דבר אליי. בשקלקלים, מצלצלים, פחות מילים. מה עם הכסף? האדומים, גם ירוקים, הכל עולה. מה עם הכסף? בשקלקלים, מצלצלים, פחות מילים. מה עם הכסף? הדולרים, גם יורואים, הכל עולה. מה עם הכסף?
All right, this group called Aksum is made up of two rappers. One is Ethiopian and one is Moroccan. They're based in Netanya, which is the city in Israel that has the highest percentage it has the highest number of Ethiopian immigrants living there. What I love about this song is that they include lots of disparate elements and they combine them to create something that I think is really legible to people who listen to Ethiopian music and also have followed the strands of labor Zionism. The song in general, it starts out as if you know a little bit of hip hop, you'll recognize the sort of bling tropes of saying kesef, money, of flashing jewelry and stuff in the opening credits, in the opening seconds. But you also find a couple of things. You've got the accordion that opens the song, which is, if you know Shirei Eretz Yisrael, songs of the land of Israel, nationalist popular music from mid 20th century, you'll find that that's a key way of starting a song. So we're situating ourselves, along with a reggae rhythm, we're situating ourselves very, very clearly within a tradition of Zionist song. You have lots of Israeli stuff in there that you'll recognize, like the hand gesture. And the fact that they're rapping in Hebrew, of course. They have other songs. Sometimes they will rap in English, and I think it's really relevant that they're choosing Hebrew for talking about this, because as the song progresses, they talk about doing work and not being paid proper recompense for it, about owing money and various things that you might recognize as associating labor and citizenship. So I think that Aksum has done, they were really popular the year that I was doing my research and my field work. And then in the subsequent years, when I would talk to younger rappers coming up, what they would say when I would ask them what they would like to get out of their career, they typically said, I'd like to do what Aksum has managed to do. So they've really made quite they're sort of aging out of youth culture, but they've made a big impact on musical production. So I think the song has managed to do a couple of things quite succinctly. In fact, all you need to do is listen to the first 10 seconds of the song, and you can hear a basic statement of intent for what they're trying to achieve aesthetically in terms of the ways that they're creatively repositioning themselves among these different tropes that Ethiopian-Israeli musicians will draw from. A second example that from the project that I dedicated a chapter to is what I call the Horn Mediascape of Levinsky Street, maybe the least gentrified street in Tel Aviv, where I spent a lot of time, and a space where Ethiopian-Israelis and Eritrean asylum seekers readily encounter one another through music. So you can see here in this image that this is the Red Sea Internet Cafe. So this is a place on Levinsky where primarily Eritrean asylum seekers would go when they needed to call home or connect with their family before everyone had smartphones. And plastered on the walls, there would always be lots of promotions for all of the different Ethiopian all of the different sort of musicians from the Horn who would be performing around Tel Aviv that weekend. And this is one of the few spaces where Ethiopians and Eritreans would really encounter one another because they do have things in common. Some of them speak the same language, Tigrinya, but their circumstances are very, very different. There are well into the number of Ethiopian-Israelis who are citizens of Israel is about 140, 150,000. And the number of Eritreans who have come is well into the tens of thousands. They came primarily in 2005 to 2009. The Ethiopian-Israelis are citizens, so they serve in the army. They identify as Jewish for the most part. They don't tend to live around Levinsky, but they will pass through as a transport hub because most of them don't live they mostly live, many of them live around the Gush Dan, the greater Dan region. Among the Ethiopian-Israeli population, because of issues about language acquisition and their professions back in Ethiopia, there is a very high rate of male unemployment among Ethiopian immigrants. And also, since many of them are religious, and also they saw returning to Israel as a renewal of the covenant, you will find Ethiopian-Israelis who vote across the spectrum of political parties. There are currently 3 Ethiopian MKs. One is in Likud, one is in the United faction, and one is in the National Religious Party. So you'll find them really across the full spectrum of Israeli politics. In contrast, Eritreans are asylum seekers. They don't have official status as settled. So for that reason, they often have quite unstable living, quite unstable accommodation. They have virtually full employment in the service sector. If you go around Tel Aviv, the jobs that Palestinians might have had up until the Second Intifada, you'll find that Eritreans and Sudanese workers will occupy those service roles today, and often have very good Hebrew as a result of it. And that there is really they constitute really a fifth column in terms of the discourses in Israeli society about the long-term way of engaging them. The attitude of the state tends to be, with any Jewish immigrants to Israel, that the incoming generation might be a kind of lost generation in terms of employment and language and their prospects and education and all of that, but the Israeli-born generation will be Sabras, and you don't really find that discourse with the Eritreans. So they come from really, although some of them will come from sort of 100 years ago, they will have come from similar circumstances. Some of them, you'll find that they occupy really different status in Israeli society, but they do interact, they do encounter one another along Levinsky Street. Their lives converge primarily around an informal economy where music is a key connector to the homeland. This is a photo of Nahum Records. I wrote about it extensively in my dissertation, and I didn't include most of it in my book because of sensitivities around the informal economy, and specifically around issues of piracy and copyright infringement and that kind of thing. In my dissertation, I framed Nahum Records as an archive and as a tastemaker, as a really, you can see it's not very big, it's about 10 square meters, if that, it's as a tiny space, safe space for learning about Ethiopian culture. The proprietor, before his death, told me that he would talk to young people literally every single day who were arriving and they just wanted to learn a little bit about Ethiopian music for the first time. The success of Nahum Records is completely dependent on its location right outside the central bus station, the Tachana Merkazit, a space that's virtually free of elites and full of Tel Aviv's migrant subcultures. So those of you who have spent time in Tel Aviv in the last 20 years, you'll know it's changed a lot. Tel Aviv has become a very rich city. Poor people have been, working class people have been pushed out of most of the neighborhoods in central Tel Aviv, and Levinsky is one of those places where if you say yes, I go to the bus station, people will say, middle class people will say, why do you go to the bus station? And the one really good reason to go is that it's a transport hub, which is what takes Ethiopian-Israelis there. Soldiers will transit in and out of there when they're on their way home for Shabbat, but there are also lots of different migrant subcultures that sort of converge around the bus station. So Sarah Henkins and Amy Horowitz have both written really good material about the Tachana Merkazit, where they talk about Filipino spaces and Nepalese spaces. There's McDonald's, of course. There are lots of Mizrahi cassette shops blaring out of every corner. And Ethiopian music and Eritrean music together, this horn mediascape, has become a very, very big presence in the station. As a composite, the repertoires that are created by Ethiopian-Israeli musicians in the decades since Ethiopian immigration to Israel are diverse, spanning jazz, soul, and hip-hop, reggae, Ethio-jazz, and pre-recorded Ethiopian music used for dancing. And this repertoire occasionally overlapped with Israeli pop music, like in the well-known examples in the Dan Reichel project that I was asked about frequently while I was doing my fieldwork, and the occasional Eurovision entry. What all of these repertoires share is a practice of embedding what I call symbolic codes of citizenship into their compositional style, fashioning musical style as a mode of interfacing with the state on their own terms. And if we think back to that first example I played of Esther Rada singing, she was singing a Shlomo Carlebach composition. So this is part of her coming to terms with her own identity after the war started. So this compositional approach took a turn in the past decade, since police brutality became an explicit issue for Ethiopian-Israelis, who took to the streets in 2015 and 2018 in their own BLM moment. The preeminent musician of this era has been Esther Rada herself, a soul singer who covered Nina Simone's repertoire extensively, fashioning herself as an aesthetic alternative to Ethiopian singers like Astor Aweke or Israeli pop stars. And you can see here that this is the cover of a short album that Esther Rada made about 10 years ago, where she did a series of 4 Nina Simone covers. She has fashioned herself like Nina Simone, the iconic African-American singer. She did the song I Wish. She did Sinner Man and 4 Women. And you can hear that she's taking quite a lot of influence from Nina Simone. She sings in a very low vocal register, and she has incorporated Nina Simone's repertoire into her concerts consistently. At the same time, in her covers of Nina Simone, she started embarking on discovering the Ethiopian repertoire that had been sort of submerged in her childhood when she immigrated to Israel. She incorporates eskesta dancing a little bit, Ethio-jazz tonality in her band. She started doing covers of Ethiopian songs too, and she dabbles in Jamaican influences like reggae rhythms. It is not really audible for most of Esther Rada's repertoire that she is Israeli in any way, and she very rarely sings in Hebrew. She has a couple of songs in Hebrew, but almost all of her songs are in English, and then there are a couple of Ethiopian covers. She has done a really successful positioning of this Afro-diasporic influence that aligns her it really, it's quite implicit, but aligns her with a trope of anti-Blackness spurring a particular mode of relationship with the state of Israel. But so to come back to this stubborn question of Ethiopian religious authenticity and why it still is coming up in 2025, really the only thing that I have left to say about that is that I open the newspaper and I frequently see photos of Ethiopian soldiers among the casualties of this really horrible war. The most reliable number that I've seen is that 5% of the military casualties are Ethiopian, putting them at triple the rate of the general population. There are specific reasons for this, very particularized reasons. They are overrepresented in the Givati Brigade, for example. But whatever one's position is on the conduct of this war, there has to come a time when people who do have official halachic status in the state, who have made this real sacrifice for the state, do deserve more than constant suspicion. I can accept that sometimes the question of whether Ethiopians are Jewish is born of curiosity more than prejudice, and that it's a civics problem if Israelis don't know about their co-citizens' roots. But my analysis of musical style suggests that Ethiopian Israelis are singularly destabilizing, not only externally, but internally to Israeli society too. Israelis have as much trouble being able to make sense of how they fit in as the outside world does. Ethiopian Israelis are living, breathing proof that that you can't say that all Israelis are quintessential settler colonists, because typically one doesn't describe because typically settler colonists aren't Black. But also, some Ethiopian Israelis live in West Bank settlements, and some of them vote for Smotrich, for example. A person who this is very strategically done and in a very nuanced way. A person who styles their hair in an afro and then votes Likud, or a person who speaks Tigrinya and hasn't managed to learn Hebrew but claims to have longed for Zion for thousands of years, or a person who considers themselves a global citizen on the basis of being visibly cosmopolitan. These are nuances of fixed categories, and they're understandably confusing. And the current government isn't known particularly for its nuance. Musicians demonstrate to us that Blackness embeds itself into repertoire and musical style in ways that can be discerned and reverse engineered. You can pull out particular musical influences, and you can reverse engineer how that is contributing to a particular citizenship narrative. But conceptually, Blackness in Israel is a provocation to push back against what both Israelis and anti-Zionists can imagine of the limits of fixed categories. Equally, and finally, this image of Esterada conveys why the existence of Ethiopian Israelis is singularly offensive to someone who sees Jewish self-determination as illegitimate. Esther disrupts so clearly the crudeness of binaries. She delivered a TEDx talk in 2020, which I'll be happy to play a few minutes of if we have time in the Q&A, in which she describes her multiple subject positions: Ethiopian, Israeli, Jewish, female. She describes them as gam, vigam, vigam, vigam. Her Blackness is not antithetical to the Zionism of her immigrant parents, and her Jewishness is not eclipsed by her Ethiopianness. Fashioning herself as Nina Simone, an African-American musical icon, puts her in direct confrontation with racism she might encounter in Israeli society. But abroad, her solidarity against anti-Blackness doesn't earn her any currency against those who consider her very existence to be an inconvenience. As a younger scholar, I was frightened by the venom with which some people out in the world reject the disruption of crude binaries, and I might have shrunk from that task as a younger researcher. But Ethiopian Israelis don't have that luxury. Both the musicians and their audiences are here, they exist, and Ethiopian musicians have something profound to say, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana, for a very stimulating talk. I'm just wondering, since we have a little bit of time, do you have any music of Esterada maybe you could play just to demonstrate?
So here's an example of her cover of Nina Simone, and what you'll hear is there's the repertoire is Nina Simone, the characterization is Nina Simone, and she adds lots and lots of Ethiopian tonality in there. So you'll recognize from the ensemble, you'll recognize Ethio jazz influences immediately. Esther starts singing, you'll be able, from listening to this, when you recognize the Ethiopian elements of the song, you might want to anticipate what her vocal style will be like. Sorry to interrupt. But the Ethiopian elements here are that it's pentatonic, it's highly modal, it has a descending contour, and it's very, very brassy. These are all the hallmarks of Ethio jazz. And as a result of that, you might expect that she'll have a very, very high-pitched voice, and that she'll be singing in Amharic. So to anyone who is listening to this, what comes next will be a profound surprise.
I know how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should like to say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the parts that keep us apart. And I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
Now, it's what I argue in the book is that lots of Ethiopian-Israeli musicians perform music, and they sort of perform themselves in the role of an Azmari. That's the folk poet of Ethiopia, where they practice a lyrical style, an approach to lyricism called semana work, which means wax and gold, where you have the words that you say, that's the wax, and then there are layers of gold underneath. This is from Lost Wax Casting. So you'll have a level that's readily apparent to the listener, and then you'll have a sort of deeper truth that comes out of it. And of course, this is very obvious in even in music that doesn't sound particular, that isn't apparently Ethiopian, where there is obviously a broader point that the musician is making in the kinds of tropes that they're pulling out about freedom, about mutual understanding. And the song is hard to listen to today because you also are aware that out there in the world there are wider debates raging about the rights of different individuals to play different kinds of repertoires. And Esther Rada hasn't shrunk away from that debate at all. And you find that younger generations of musicians in the Israeli-born generation is really strongly identifies with the African diaspora, particularly with Tupac Shakur, which there might be some questions about.
Yeah, that might be a nice thing to expand on, but let me provide some other thoughtful questions that have come in. What are the repercussions of analyzing the Jewish Ethiopians' music in Israel according to anti-Blackness theories? Since most of these theories are based on the racial history of the U.S., what needs to change when being manifested in a non-U.S. society, especially in Israel?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The first thing I would say is that in Israel, the tropes of anti-Blackness have also been taken up by Palestinian musicians in a big way since the 90s. So if you in the 90s, in 2008, there was a documentary about Palestinian hip hop. It was called Slingshot Hip Hop, and the best known Palestinian rapper Tamer Nafar takes a Tupac album off of his shelf, and he says, "You see this guy Tupac? I am Tupac. We are like Tupac." And that's exactly what people say in Netanya. If you go to Netanya with its huge Ethiopian population, there's a mural of Tupac on the wall. You'll find murals of Tupac everywhere. So there is a really because of American cultural hegemony, there is in lots of parts of the world with hip hop culture, there is a really strong association with African American culture. But among Ethiopians, there's an additional layer that has to do with Ethiopia as an alternative Zion, particularly for Rastafarians, and the sort of like the kind of credibility that Ethiopians have in reggae circles and that kind of stuff. So, and also the experience of Ethiopians is categorically different from the experience of African Americans because of the migration history, which was a voluntary migration history, and that their life in Ethiopia was shaped by anti-Semitic tropes. So they are fundamentally different experiences, but the positioning is the interesting thing. The fact that the fact that Ethiopian-Israelis say we are Black and we are embracing Blackness, and also we are Jewish and we are embracing Jewishness is it's sui generis.
Wonderful. Well, we have so many questions coming in, and I just want to give them an opportunity. They're very thoughtful. This next one is a little bit longer. It comes from someone who is a scholar of the Ethiopian community here in Los Angeles. They thank you for a fascinating study. As you know, Blackness is a historically situated and often contested term carrying specific genealogies in the Americas shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and systematic anti-Blackness. Number one, I'm curious how you approach the use of the term in relation to Ethiopian-Israeli identity, particularly when it emerged organically from the communities you studied, or if it functions more as an analytical frame. Two, given the global resonance of Black struggle in music, do you see Ethiopian-Israeli musicians forming transnational solidarities with other Black artists from Africa, the Caribbean, or the US? Or is their articulation of Blackness highly localized and contextually distinct? Finally, three, does your research engage Eritrean musicians or asylum seekers? And if so, how do they self-identify with these complex racial and social constructs? Thanks again for your time and opening a space for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. These are such good questions. I'll need to keep reading them as I go so I don't get off track. First of all, Ethiopians didn't always identify themselves as Black. This is a floating signifier, right? So the word Ethiopia itself, the word Abyssinia itself, right? The process of migration to Israel, the historian Stephen Kaplan talks about this at length. He talks about the process of racialized reckoning for Ethiopians in the 1990s was a process of becoming Black, because they in Ethiopia, their primary identity was a Jewish identity, and it was a source of persecution, or at least marginalization. So the process of arriving and being referred to as Black and coming to embody this space of being the visible minority within a Jewish society was among the different destabilizing factors that Ethiopian Jews experienced in the 20th century. It was one of them. Another one would be language, because if you sort of trace the 20th century, you'll find that the most Ethiopian-Israelis will, each generation of people who I now call Ethiopian-Israelis, they would each have a different mother tongue going back 4 generations. This is also profoundly destabilizing and something that other Jewish immigrant groups might experience. So part of the connecting to a global Afro-diasporic network is part of recognizing in themselves connections to groups of people with whom they might not have previously recognized connections. But the main similarity is the imposition from the outside of otherness. In terms of solidarities with other Black artists, there's been lots of it. So a lot of the musicians I interviewed, and also a lot of the audience members who I interviewed, talked about making that first trip to Ethiopia. Some of them documented the trips, and a lot of people I would talk to going around from Azmari Bet to Azmari Bet, I would talk to, or cultural restaurants. I would talk to young Ethiopians who had just finished the army, and they would say, well, there isn't really anything for me in Thailand or India. I'm going to go to Ethiopia, and I'm going to go to the town where my parents were born. There was an appetite to reconnect among the Israeli-born generation that probably a lot of their parents would not have initially expected of them. And as a result of that, so a lot of the musicians would say, I would love to play in Ethiopia, or some of them would say, I did a concert in Ethiopia. The Beta dance troupe did a concert when I was doing my fieldwork in 2009. They had just come from a tour in Ethiopia. And they said that it was like a profoundly healing experience to go to Addis Ababa and be accepted as artists. And then you also find groups like the Idan Reichel Project, who a little bit, I talk about them at length in some positive ways and some critical ways in the book, about the kinds of collaborations that they were doing with Ethiopian musicians who were sometimes feeling that it wasn't an equitable partnership, and also bringing in lots of connections with West African musicians and kora players and forging all kinds of connections. So there was quite a lot of engagement with African and Afro-diasporic musicians. That has, of course, changed the last couple of years with the issue of cultural boycotts. But in general, that comes primarily from the Western Hemisphere. African musicians are quite keen to have continued to be quite keen to partner with Ethiopian-Israeli musicians to go to Tel Aviv to record albums, because they have quite good recording studios, and for mutual investment between Ethiopia and Israel. And in terms of Eritreans, the phenomenon has been sort of growing and growing of Eritreans sort of integrating and not integrating into Israeli society. The person who's done really good research about this is Sarah Henkins. But what I found was just I found it incredibly interesting that while to meet Ethiopian musicians, I often had to travel 2 hours outside of Tel Aviv and go to an absorption center and deal with social workers as the gatekeepers of getting access to these musicians. The Eritreans are right there in Tel Aviv. And as a result of being right in the hub and not having economic options of support of the state and citizenship, their economic circumstances and their citizenship circumstances are often very, very upsetting. But they often pick up Hebrew pretty quickly. They've started to have families and send their kids to, for example, the Bialik school. And there's lots happening in that space. In terms of Ethiopians and Eritreans relating with each other, you will find that this is an issue across the Horn diaspora. I have every student I have in London who is Eritrean will identify very strongly as Eritrean. They will often have one Ethiopian parent, for example. So you will find that there are quite intimate connections between Ethiopians and Eritreans that are often sort of submerged and actively repressed because of the political conflict over the decades between the two countries.
That's great. We have so many questions. We're only going to be able to get to a few more. And those of you that ask questions, they will all be furnished afterwards to Ilana. So another question that has come in is as follows. I wondered about the position of Ethiopian Jews related to the legacies of the Italian invasion and occupation of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Specifically, in the case of Eritrea, there was a specific context of intermarriage, but also an Italo-Ethiopian identity formation. How were the Ethiopian Jews engaged with this context that evolved for most of the 20th century, but particularly during World War II and its aftermath?
That's a really good question. I'm not a historian, so I will defer to the historians for these things. Because the Ethiopian Jews were rural, my impression, well, a lot of them came from the Tigray region, which is the region where the really horrible sort of civil conflict is playing out now at the moment. But my understanding from talking to Ethiopian Israelis is that because they were rural, they were not terribly connected to the Italians. That's just the impression that I got from the people that I spoke to. So I don't have that much to say about that, except that if you go to Rome, you will find one of these international hubs, another one of these international hubs of Restaurant Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro is not in Ethiopia or Eritrea, but it's an Ethiopian-Eritrean restaurant where, again, sort of Horn of Africa migrants will encounter one another, and Italy as the invading as the invader that had an impact is sort of the imprint is still there, that there's a connection. Also, when you go to Ethiopia, every cafe has very fancy Italian coffee machines, but you don't really hear very much. I didn't hear very much in my research in Israel about the Italians at all, actually. That might be because I was working on music and I'm not a historian.
So before we conclude, a couple of music questions. Are there any examples of Ethiopian-Israeli music that is based on traditional Ethiopian style?
Oh, yeah. So there's one musician who I didn't work with at all on for my book, is Abate Barihun. He was a musician back in Ethiopia. Now he's a jazz musician, and his compositions are based on the modal system, Kinyit. And he's had a pretty successful career doing all kinds of collaborations with traditional Ethiopian music as the basis. But the main one is that in Ethiopia, there is this, the one place that the Azmari performs is at the Tejbet, that's like a sort of beer house, or what's called the cultural restaurant, which is primarily staged for tourists. So anywhere, if you want to hear traditional Ethiopian music, anywhere in the world, the place to go is to the biggest Ethiopian restaurant in town and ask which night they have live music, because almost all of them do. You'll find it in Washington, you'll find it in London, you'll find it in Rome, and you'll find it in Tel Aviv. And that was the first place I went for my field work, really. In Tel Aviv, there was a place that I went every Thursday night, and it was from 10 to 3 every Thursday night. They had a couple of instrumentalists, a female singer who was also a dancer, and then also you would have people coming in, young people who lived in the absorption centers and would be the leaders of dance troops, and they would come in and sort of develop their chops by playing in an Azmari bet or a cultural restaurant. That's the main place. And when I took lessons with an Azmari who was sort of just starting to develop his profile on this circuit.
So who would be attending those restaurants or nightclubs? You said there were some younger people, but how would you describe the people who were attending there?
Oh, it was really fun. That was the best part of my field work. About 90% of the people there, 95%, were Ethiopians. Very few Eritrean asylum seekers at the time when I was doing my research. Maybe that will have changed by now. It would be a combination of since Ethiopian-Israeli, in Ethiopia, Beta Yisrael lived in big households of extended families, up to 30 people. And when they were broken up into nuclear families, when they arrived in Israel, it was quite an adjustment for people to just be living with, parents and children rather than the siblings and the aunts and uncles. So what you would find very often is that these families would be scattered across the country. Someone would live in Hadera, and someone would live in Netanya, and someone would live in Beersheba, and someone would live in Jerusalem, and they would converge on a Thursday night for the whole family to get together and sort of just spend time together. So you would find that quite a lot. There would be quite big groups. And it would usually be a big family that was just getting together habitually. You would also find lots of young people everywhere you go, the record stores, clubs, restaurants. You would find young people who were, if you asked them what they were there for, they would be talking about reconnecting. Reconnecting is a really, really big thing for everyone before and after the army. And even the musicians talk about it too. The musicians talk about going into the army and being in a military band and getting really professionalized training, and then finishing and feeling that they needed to reconnect with their roots, and then learning the repertoire that way. Maybe seeking out one of the Azmaris who lives in the town they live in, and taking lessons, and that's the way that they start to reconnect.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. That's really fascinating. Our last question, have there been Ethiopian and Palestinian musical collaborations?
Sure. So So the best known one is the Idan Reichel project. So I give a whole chapter in the book to it. So I do so that it gets and it's gotten plenty of media attention. So Idan Reichel is sort of the facilitator of this big band that has people from all of the different Edot represented, and he has a couple of Ethiopian singers. The best known is Kabra Kasai. She's since embarked on like an international recording career. And then there were always Palestinian musicians who came in and out, primarily Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then you'll also find rappers sort of encountering each other on the scene. They sort of in sort of club vibes. That is I think pretty muted these days. I think there's been part of the difficulty of the research. One of the most difficult aspects of doing this research for me was accepting the way that Ethiopian-Israelis are singularly targeted as sort of agents of the state, and sort of that their very existence is part of a Hasbara conspiracy. That whenever I would hear someone say, well, no, not all Jews are white. Look at this Ethiopian population. And people would say, well, that's sort of, that's Hasbara or whatever. And so I think because they have been sort of put front and center as a target in these discourses, they are sort of among the first who are targeted for not being part of these collaborations.
So lastly, any recommendations for people on where they, good way to listen to some of the music?
Yeah, I would say actually one of the first things to do would be to listen to the Ethio-Peaks musical CD collection. It's by Francis, put together by Francis Falsetto, Buddha Music. It's not Jewish and Israeli musicians, but that's sort of I think if you need one foundational set of source material, Ethio-Peaks is source material that they draw on very, very heavily. Francis has brought Ethio-Peaks to Israel a couple of times. Musicians from the series tour Israel all the time. And in the last 10 years or so, Israel has really become a key node in the Ethiopian musical diaspora for this reason, partly because Israel has good resources in that respect. So I would start by listening to that. I would follow, if you're on social media, I would follow some of the musicians like Esther Rada and see what they're recommending. There's a whole reggae subsection of this for all the discrimination that Ethiopians encounter in daily life. They are welcomed with open arms into reggae bands. So Gili Yalo is sort of one of the best known of the musicians from that scene. And go to clubs. So places like Barzilai in Tel Aviv will have they'll have sort of Ethiopian club nights all the time. And then go to Nahum Records. If you go to a place like Nahum Records on Levinsky, you find people are super welcoming. They're always really, really happy to sort of to enculturate people into this whole media sphere.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's so good to hear about your reflections on the music from the past, and really, there are a lot of affirmative thanks in the question and answer box, but just a big thank you to you for taking the time to share this with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will try to answer some of these other questions I'll try to type them in before the room gets shut.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.